Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 1, focusing on Introduction to Revelation, Historical Perspectives, Authorship, Date, and Apocalyptic Genre, Thomas R. Schreiner, Revelation, 1-66. Welcome, scholars, to our advanced seminar on the Book of Revelation. As we embark on this rigorous academic journey, we must first address the elephant in the room, the sheer, intimidating complexity of this text. The great English writer G. K. Chesterton once humorously observed that while St. John the Evangelist saw many strange monsters in his vision, he saw no creature so wild as one of his own commentators. It is a brilliant and sobering reminder for all of us. As scholars, we run the risk of becoming the very monsters we are trying to interpret if we force this beautiful, poetic text into rigid, anachronistic boxes. Let us turn our attention to the hermeneutical challenges and the profound effective imagery that defines this apocalypse. The great theologian Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, recognized this challenge perfectly. He noted that the apocalypse contains many obscure sayings designed specifically to exercise the mind of the reader. He argued that the author intentionally repeats the same concepts in drastically different ways, creating a sense of shifting landscapes. Imagine walking through a gallery where the same historical event is painted by 50 different surrealist artists. The subject remains the same, but the perspectives are dizzying. Yet, Augustine brings us back to solid ground. He reminds us that amidst the confusing beasts and cosmic signs, passages like, "He shall wipe away all tears from their eyes" are radiantly clear. Augustine believed that God providentially wrapped certain texts in a dense, dark fog to break our intellectual pride. We are forced to labor hard for the truth, preventing the boredom that comes when things are just too easy to figure out. It is a profound pedagogical strategy by the divine author. Moving forward to modern scholarship, G. B. Caird makes a fascinating observation that resonates deeply with our contemporary culture. He says that Revelation is perhaps the most important book in the New Testament for a generation whose mental eye has been starved of imagery. Think about that for a moment. We live in a hyper-rational, post-Enlightenment world that demands empirical data and logical syllogisms. We have lost the art of reading symbols. The apocalyptic genre bypasses our rigid logic and speaks directly to our imagination. Adela Yarbrough Collins builds on this, arguing that John the Revelator actually creates a virtual reality experience for his first-century audience. By using potent symbols, John handles the hearer's thoughts, attitudes, and feelings, drawing them into a narrative plot that invites imaginative participation. To understand why John uses such extreme, bizarre, and sometimes terrifying imagery, we must look to the brilliant Southern Gothic writer, Flannery O'Connor. Although she was speaking of her own modern fiction, her words perfectly describe John's apocalyptic method. O'Connor stated that when a Christian writer sees distortions in modern life that the general audience accepts as natural, the writer must use violent means to get their vision across. She said, "To the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind you draw large and startling figures." This is exactly what John is doing. The early Christians were becoming dangerously comfortable with the Roman Empire. The idolatry and economic exploitation of Rome were starting to look normal to them. So, John had to shout. He had to draw massive, terrifying dragons and grotesque beasts to shock his audience into realizing the demonic reality behind Rome's glittering facade. Scholar K. Huber affirms this pastoral purpose. The imagery is multicolored, diverse, and deeply ambivalent. It is both fascinating and offensive. It refuses to be reduced to simple, dictionary definitions. Instead, it targets the emotions. Why? Because, as Huber notes, it is our affected emotions that ultimately shape our commitments and actions. John wants to stir up the visceral feelings of his readers to encourage unwavering faithfulness to God and the Christian community in the face of immense cultural pressure. Therefore, as we study this text, we must not only ask what the symbols mean, but what they are designed to make us feel. Now that we have established the profound purpose behind the startling imagery of Revelation, we must honestly confront the shadow side of its reception history. The truth is, the book of Revelation has had a highly checkered, and sometimes deeply troubled, history within the Christian Church and the broader cultural landscape. Many brilliant minds have utterly detested this book. Let us start with the towering figure of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. Early in his ministry, Luther famously despised the Apocalypse. In his prefaces, he openly lamented that the book neither taught nor revealed Christ. He called it a concealed and mute prophecy. Luther was a man who prized the clear, unambiguous proclamation of justification by faith, as found in Paul's epistles. When he looked at Revelation, he saw a chaotic mess. He complained bitterly that for centuries, interpreters had merely brewed up stupid things out of their own heads when trying to understand it. He even mocked the book's own opening blessing, stating, "They are supposed to be blessed who keep what is written in this book, and yet no one knows what that is, to say nothing of keeping it." While Luther later softened his stance and used the book to attack the papacy, his initial hostility represents a common frustration among believers. But as we move into the modern era, the critiques shift from theological frustration to outright psychological and moral condemnation. The famous playwright George Bernard Shaw brutally dismissed Revelation as nothing more than the curious record of the visions of a drug addict, calling its inclusion in the biblical canon an absurdity. The pioneering psychoanalyst Carl Jung was deeply disturbed by the text. Jung looked at the violent judgments in the book and concluded that the God of Revelation represents an unheard-of fury of destruction against the human race. Jung argued that the Christ depicted here behaves like a bad-tempered, power-conscious boss, orchestrating a veritable orgy of hatred, wrath, and vindictiveness. From a psychological standpoint, Jung saw the text as a manifestation of suppressed rage. The English writer D. H. Lawrence took a similar literary approach. He claimed that when read superficially, it is the most detestable book in the Bible. Lawrence accused the author, John, of harboring a grandiose, resentful scheme to wipe out and annihilate everybody who wasn't part of his small, elite group. Lawrence argued that the core psychological drive of Revelation was a desire to murder the powerful simply to seize that power for oneself. Even the esteemed modern literary critic Harold Bloom echoed this, stating that resentment and not love is the teaching of the text, calling it a book completely without wisdom, goodness, or kindness. How do we as scholars respond to this overwhelming hermeneutics of suspicion? Are these critics correct? Thomas Schreiner argues, and I concur, that these detractors profoundly misunderstand the book. They read the text divorced from its historical context of profound suffering and imperial oppression. When marginalized, persecuted people cry out for divine justice, their language is inherently disruptive and severe. To read Revelation as a manifesto of petty resentment is to completely ignore the very real blood of the martyrs crying out from beneath the altar. The violent imagery is not a symptom of John's psychological imbalance, rather, it is a sophisticated theological assertion that the idolatrous and violent systems of this world will ultimately be dismantled by the sovereign justice of God. Our task in this seminar is to move past these superficial reactions and uncover the profound pastoral comfort embedded within this challenging text. As we dive into the actual mechanics of interpreting Revelation, we must familiarize ourselves with the major maps scholars have drawn over the centuries. Generally, we categorize interpretations into four major paradigms. While these categories are a bit simplistic, they are essential for understanding the history of exegesis. Let's begin by examining the first two, the preterist and the historicist paradigms. The preterist approach derives its name from the Latin word praeter, meaning past. This paradigm firmly anchors the message of the book in the first century. It emphasizes, quite correctly, that John was writing to 7 literal, historical churches located in the Roman province of Asia, modern-day Western Turkey. As scholar Urania notes, John did not construct imaginary recipients, he wrote to real people dealing with real socio-economic and political pressures. The great strength of preterism is that it forces us to ask, what did this mean to the original audience? However, preterism has some significant weaknesses, especially in its extreme forms. Some critical preterists simply claim that John predicted the end of the world in his own day, and since it didn't happen, he was just historically mistaken. This, of course, destroys the canonical authority of the text. On the other hand, Some evangelical preterists argue that almost everything in Revelation was actually fulfilled in the year AD 70, when the Roman army destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They argue that the cosmic language of destruction is just prophetic idiom for the end of the Old Covenant system. But there are massive problems with this AD 70 view. First, as Schreiner and G.K. Beale point out, John leans heavily on Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7, which point to a universal, cosmic judgment of all pagan nations, not just a localized judgment on Jerusalem. Second, and perhaps more devastatingly, we have to ask ourselves, why would the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem be the central, burning concern for Christians living hundreds of miles away in Asia Minor? Many of these believers were Gentiles. The fall of Jerusalem would not have dramatically changed their daily struggles with local trade guilds or Roman imperial cults. Furthermore, it is very difficult to read the glorious promise at the end of Revelation, that there will be no more death, crying, or pain, and claim that this has been a reality since the year 70. It clearly points to a consummation yet to come. The second major paradigm is the historicist approach. This view treats Revelation like a chronological blueprint or a literal chart of Western human history. Historicists look at the 7 seals or the 7 churches and try to map them onto specific centuries. For example, some dispensational historicists have claimed that the Church of Thyatira represents the corrupt Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, Sardis represents the Lutheran Reformation, and Laodicea represents the apostate modern church. While this method was incredibly popular during the Middle Ages and the Reformation, especially because it allowed Protestant reformers to conveniently label the Pope as the Antichrist, it is almost universally rejected by serious scholars today. Why? Because it is completely arbitrary. It relies entirely on the interpreter's subjective reading of history. More importantly, it violates the fundamental rule of biblical interpretation: a text cannot mean what it never could have meant to its original readers. If Revelation was actually a secret code about the rise of Islam in the 7th century or the French Revolution in the 18th century, it would have been absolute gibberish to the suffering believers in 1st century Ephesus or Smyrna. Therefore, while historicism is a fascinating subject for studying the history of theology, it is not a viable exegetically method for understanding John's original intent. Continuing our exploration of interpretive frameworks, we turn to the third and fourth major paradigms, the futurist and idealist approaches. The futurist approach is probably the one you are most familiar with, as it heavily dominates modern evangelical pop culture. This paradigm views the vast majority of Revelation, specifically everything from chapter 4 onward, as a detailed prophecy of events that will occur at the very end of human history. This view has ancient roots, but it was massively popularized in the 19th and 20th centuries by the dispensationalist movement, led by figures like John Nelson Darby, and later by popular authors like Hal Lindsey and the Left Behind series. The theological strength of futurism is that it takes the ultimate consummation of history seriously. It rightly affirms that Jesus will bodily return to judge the living and the dead. However, from a rigorous academic standpoint, rigid futurism suffers from a massive flaw. Just like the historicist view, if chapters 4 through 22 are strictly about Apache helicopters, computer microchips, and geopolitical wars in the 21st century, then the book offered absolutely zero practical comfort to the first-century Christians who were facing martyrdom under the Roman Empire. Furthermore, popular futurism constantly falls into the trap of what scholars call newspaper eschatology. This is the dangerous practice of trying to map current events and political figures directly onto the symbols of Revelation. As scholar Barbara Rossing rightly critiques, this approach is completely capricious. The interpretation has to constantly shift every time the political headlines change. Moving on, the fourth paradigm is the idealist approach. The idealist looks at the chaos of the other three views and decides to step out of history altogether. According to this view, Revelation does not refer to the specific events of the first century, nor does it refer to specific future events. Instead, it is a timeless allegory. It is a poetic depiction of the perpetual spiritual warfare between good and evil, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of the world. The great advantage of the idealist view is that it makes the message of the book immediately applicable to every single generation of Christians. Whether you live in 2nd century Rome, 16th century Germany, or 21st century Seoul, the principles remain the same. The weakness, however, is that it tends to overly spiritualize the text. It unmoors revelation from the concrete, historical reality that John actually lived in, and it threatens to turn the literal, physical return of Christ into a mere philosophical concept. So, where does this leave us? Thomas Schreiner, along with the vast majority of contemporary biblical scholars, advocates for what we call an eclectic approach. Instead of forcing the text into one rigid box, the eclectic approach takes the best elements of all four. We read the text like a preterist, rigorously grounding John's symbols in the socio-political reality of 1st century Asia Minor. We read the text like an idealist, drawing out the timeless theological principles of how the Church must resist idolatrous state power throughout history. And finally, we read the text like a futurist, maintaining the absolute conviction that history is linear and is driving toward a definite, physical consummation when Jesus Christ will return to make all things new. By blending these approaches, we honor the multi-layered depth of the apocalyptic genre. Having established our exegetically framework, we must now turn to the fascinating and often turbulent history of how the early Christian Church received and interpreted the Book of Revelation. The story of the early patristic reception is largely a story about the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ mentioned in chapter 20. In the 2nd century, the dominant view was what we call chiliasm, derived from the Greek word for 1,000. Figures like Papias of Hierapolis read chapter 20 highly literally. Papias envisioned a coming golden age on earth where nature would be supernaturally restored, producing massive, miraculous grapes and abundant food. It was a vision of a literal, earthly paradise. However, this literal interpretation soon caused major problems for the Orthodox Church. A charismatic, prophetic movement known as the Montanists arose in the 2nd century. The Montanists combined intense apocalyptic enthusiasm with extreme asceticism, and they boldly claimed that the literal New Jerusalem was going to physically drop out of the sky and land in their small hometown of Papusa in Phrygia. This kind of fanaticism terrified the established church leadership in Rome. The backlash was severe. A Roman churchman named Gaius was so repulsed by the Montanists' apocalyptic frenzy that he tried to throw the Book of Revelation out of the Bible entirely. To do this, Gaius spread the rumor that Revelation was not written by the Apostle John, but was actually a forgery written by a famous Gnostic heretic named Cerinthus. This shows us how controversial the text was. People were willing to declare it heretical just to stop people from reading it literally. Thankfully, brilliant Orthodox scholars like Hippolytus defended the book's apostolic authority, but they began to move away from the literal earthly millennium to avoid the errors of the Montanists. We also see the emergence of the very first formal commentaries. The oldest surviving commentary we have is by Victorinus, who died a martyr's death in 304 AD. Victorinus is incredibly important because he introduced the concept of recapitulation, the idea that the 7 seals, trumpets, and bowls are not strictly chronological, but rather repeat the same period of history from different camera angles. But the most massive earthquake in the interpretation of Revelation came at the end of the 4th century through 2 men, a brilliant North African scholar named Tychonius, and the legendary theologian Augustine of Hippo. Tychonius completely revolutionized eschatology by arguing that the 1,000-year millennium is not a future earthly kingdom, but rather represents the entire present era between the first and second coming of Jesus Christ. Augustine, recognizing the brilliance of this framework, adopted it and expanded upon it. Augustine taught that believers enter the millennial reign right now, spiritually, when they are baptized. He framed the entire apocalypse not as a timetable of future political events, but as a cosmic, spiritual conflict between the city of God, which operates on divine love, and the city of man, which operates on the love of self and power. This spiritualized, amillennial reading formulated by Augustine was so intellectually satisfying and pastorally grounding that it effectively killed off chiliasm in the mainstream church. Edited and promoted by scholars like Jerome, this Augustinian framework became the absolute dominant lens through which the Western Church would read Revelation for well over 1,000 years. As we move out of the patristic era and into the Middle Ages, the interpretation of Revelation takes a dramatic, highly political turn. The Augustinian spiritual framework began to crack, and scholars returned to the historicist paradigm, treating the book as a chronological map of church history. The most influential figure in this shift was a 12th-century abbot named Joachim of Fiore. Joachim was a mystical thinker who proposed a radical new theology of history. He divided all of human history into three overlapping Trinitarian epochs: the age of the Father, which corresponded to the Old Testament, the age of the Son, which corresponded to the New Testament and the early Church, and the coming age of the Spirit, which he believed was about to dawn in his own time, spearheaded by poor monastic orders. But Joachim made one fateful prediction that would echo for centuries. Looking at the corruption in the Church, he warned that a future pope might actually be the Antichrist. Once that theological grenade was thrown, the explosion was inevitable. In the following centuries, as the Franciscan monks preached absolute poverty, they looked in horror at the immense wealth, political power, and military might of the papacy. The rhetoric became weaponized. We see an astounding historical moment where the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, and Pope Innocent IV literally declared each other to be the Antichrist, each accusing the other of fulfilling the number 666. The imagery of Revelation was no longer just theology, it was high-stakes political propaganda. Pre-reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia picked up this apocalyptic framework. They used the stark contrasts in Revelation, the pure bride of Christ versus the wealthy, corrupt whore of Babylon, to launch devastating critiques against the institutional corruption of the Roman Catholic hierarchy. Huss was so precise in his critique that he ended up being burned at the stake for heresy in 1415. When we arrive at the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, this historicist, anti-papal reading goes mainstream. As we noted earlier, Martin Luther initially hated the Book of Revelation. But once he realized how effectively it could be used as a polemical weapon, he changed his tune. Luther, Calvin, and the major reformers almost universally adopted the view that the papal office itself was the apocalyptic Antichrist. However, this explosive apocalyptic fervor could not be contained by the magisterial reformers. On the radical fringes of the Reformation, things turned violent and chaotic. Radical figures like Thomas Müntzer claimed to receive direct apocalyptic visions and used the language of Revelation to incite the lower classes to take up physical arms against the aristocracy, resulting in the tragic bloodshed of the Peasants' War. Other Anabaptist leaders like Hans Hut and Melchior Hoffman began setting literal dates for the return of Christ and the dawn of the millennium, predicting it would happen in 1528 or 1533. When these dates failed, it led to massive disillusionment and tragedy, such as the violent takeover of the city of Munster. This era serves as a grim historical warning to our seminar: when the highly symbolic, visionary language of Revelation is violently literalized and fused with immediate political grievances, the results are almost always disastrous. It highlights why rigorous, historically grounded exegesis is not just an academic exercise, but a pastoral necessity to protect the Church from radicalism. Moving into the modern era, the interpretation of Revelation undergoes several massive pendulum swings, reacting to the shifting cultural zeitgeist of the Western world. In the 17th and 18th centuries, following the consolidation of the Protestant Reformation, a profound wave of theological optimism swept through the Church. This gave rise to the eschatological system known as postmillennialism. The Puritans in England, and great theologians like Jonathan Edwards in America, looked at the rapid spread of the gospel and the advancements in society, and they read Revelation through a lens of profound hope. They believed that the catastrophic judgments of the seals and trumpets were mostly in the past. They anticipated that the Holy Spirit would eventually bring about a gradual, worldwide triumph of Christianity. They believed the earth would enter a massive golden age of peace and righteousness, the millennium, and only after this golden age would Jesus physically return. At the exact same time, it is fascinating to note that Catholic scholars, like the Spanish Jesuit Luis del Alcázar, brilliantly revived the ancient preterist approach. Why? It was a defensive maneuver. By arguing that the Antichrist and the Beast were actually first-century Roman emperors like Nero, Catholic scholars effectively neutralized the Protestant claim that the Pope was the Antichrist. But this era of postmillennial optimism could not survive the brutality of the modern age. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th century, the horrors of the American Civil War, World War I, and World War II completely shattered the idea that humanity was progressing toward a golden age. Theological pessimism set in, paving the way for the explosive rise of dispensational futurism. Inaugurated by an Anglo-Irish clergyman named John Nelson Darby, this system argued that society was not getting better, it was spiraling toward imminent apocalyptic destruction. Darby introduced a highly literal hermeneutic, strictly dividing God's plan for the ethnic nation of Israel from his plan for the Christian church. He popularized the concept of the pre-tribulational rapture, the idea that the church will be secretly snatched away to heaven before the horrors of Revelation begin. Advanced by institutions like Dallas Theological Seminary and popularized by endless paperback novels, dispensationalism became the absolute dominant lens for grassroots evangelicals. However, a massive chasm opened up between popular church culture and the academic world. While the masses read dispensational paperbacks, the universities embraced the historical critical method. Legendary scholars like Wilhelm Bucer and R.H. Charles stripped away the theology and treated Revelation as an ancient historical artifact. They dissected its Greek grammar, analyzed its sources, and painstakingly compared it to Jewish apocalyptic literature and Roman imperial cult practices. Today, academic scholarship on Revelation is incredibly diverse. We have socio-rhetorical analyses, feminist critiques, and intense historical investigations. Some modern scholars, like Francis Maloney, have even argued that Revelation isn't about the future at all, but is simply a poetic reflection on the victory Jesus already achieved on the cross. While Schreiner respects this focus on the cross, he strongly pushes back, arguing that texts describing the new heavens and new earth undeniably point to a glorious, future eschatological consummation. As graduate students, you must learn to navigate this massive divide between popular futurist assumptions and rigorous academic historical analysis. Having surveyed the vast landscape of how people have read this book over 2 millennia, we must now turn our critical gaze to the text itself. Who wrote this mesmerizing, terrifying, and glorious apocalypse? To answer this, we must first interrogate the internal evidence, what the text actually says about its own origins. The opening verses of Revelation establish a profound chain of divine mediation. The revelation is given by God the Father, to Jesus Christ, who gives it to an angelic messenger, who finally delivers it to a human servant named John. As scholar Ian Boxall points out, John carefully constructs a visionary persona. Throughout the book, he constantly reminds us of his sensory experience. Over 80 times, John emphasizes, "I saw," or "I heard." He presents himself not just as a passive tape recorder, but as an active participant who weeps, eats scrolls, and falls down in worship. As modern scholars note, this relentless focus on his own first-hand experience serves a crucial literary function: it establishes verisimilitude. It tells the original audience, "I was really there. You can trust this witness." But here is where Revelation breaks all the rules of its own genre. In the ancient world, if you were writing an apocalypse, the standard practice was to use a fake name, what scholars call pseudonymity. You would claim that your book was written by an ancient, legendary hero like Enoch, Abraham, or Ezra, in order to give it artificial authority. But our author doesn't do that. He simply calls himself John. He writes a pastoral letter to 7 real churches, telling them he is currently suffering in exile on a small, rocky island called Patmos. He expects them to know exactly who he is based on his first name alone. Now, John was the 5th most common name in Palestinian Judaism at the time. So, which John is it? Before we look at church tradition, we can deduce a massive amount of information about this man just by analyzing his writing. Scholar David Unn outlines 4 indisputable pieces of internal evidence proving that this John was a Palestinian Jewish Christian. First, the author has an absolutely staggering mastery of the Old Testament. He weaves hundreds of subtle allusions to the Hebrew prophets into his Greek text without ever using a formal quotation formula. Second, the apocalyptic genre itself is fundamentally a product of Palestinian Jewish theology. Third, the author possesses an incredibly deep, intimate knowledge of the architecture, rituals, and liturgy of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And fourth, he writes in a very strange, idiosyncratic dialect that scholars call Semitizing Greek. It is Greek vocabulary mapped onto Hebrew thought patterns and grammar. Therefore, whatever else we might conclude, we know this for certain: the author is a first-century, Jewish Christian prophet from Palestine, thoroughly steeped in the Hebrew scriptures, who possessed immense spiritual authority over the Gentile churches in Asia Minor. If the internal evidence proves the author was a prominent Palestinian Jewish Christian named John, how do we identify him specifically? Today, the vast majority of secular and critical biblical scholars argue that the author was simply an unknown, itinerant prophet who happened to be named John. However, Thomas Schreiner, adopting a minority but highly robust position, argues for traditional apostolic authorship, that the author is none other than John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus's inner circle. Why hold this traditional view? Because the external, historical evidence from the early church is overwhelmingly strong. In fact, the patristic evidence supporting John the Apostle as the author of Revelation is arguably the strongest external attestation for any book in the entire New Testament. By the middle of the 2nd century, around the year 150 AD, Justin Martyr explicitly writes that the Apostle John was the author. But the absolute cornerstone of the apostolic argument rests on the testimony of a profound theologian named Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus, writing around 180 AD, emphatically declares in his massive work, Against Heresies, that the exact same John who wrote the Gospel of John and the Epistles is the one who saw the apocalyptic visions on Patmos. Now, in the academic world, we don't just blindly trust ancient writers, we evaluate their sources. Why should we trust Irenaeus? Because Irenaeus possesses a pristine, verifiable epistemological chain of transmission. We know from historical records that Irenaeus, as a young man, was personally mentored and discipled by a famous bishop named Polycarp in the city of Smyrna. And Polycarp was directly discipled by the Apostle John himself. Do you see the chain of custody? John to Polycarp to Irenaeus. Some modern critical scholars have tried to dismiss this by arguing that Irenaeus was just a little boy who only met Polycarp once or twice, and his memory was faulty. But scholar C. E. Hill has systematically dismantled this critique. Hill analyzed the original Greek text where Irenaeus describes his time with Polycarp. Irenaeus uses imperfect tense verbs, which in Greek indicate continuous, repeated, and habitual action in the past. This proves that Irenaeus didn't just meet Polycarp in passing, he sat under his teaching regularly and extensively memorized his discourses. When you have a brilliant bishop like Irenaeus stating as a matter of historical fact that his beloved mentor's mentor wrote the Book of Revelation, that testimony cannot be easily dismissed by modern skepticism. This apostolic claim is not isolated. It is backed up by a massive chorus of early church heavyweights: Hegesippus, Clement of Alexandria, the fiery lawyer Tertullian in Carthage, and the genius scholar Origen in Alexandria. All of these distinct geographical centers of early Christianity independently verified the exact same historical tradition: the son of Zebedee wrote the Apocalypse. If we are to reject apostolic authorship, we have to assume that the entire global network of the 2nd century church suffered from collective amnesia regarding one of their most terrifying and controversial texts. That is a historical leap that many conservative scholars, including Schreiner, are unwilling to take. If the historical tradition of Irenaeus is so strong, why do the majority of modern scholars reject the idea that the Apostle John wrote Revelation? To answer that, we must look at the brilliant critical work of a 3rd-century bishop named Dionysius of Alexandria. Long before the European Enlightenment invented the historical critical method, Dionysius practically utilized it. Dionysius analyzed the Book of Revelation and compared it to the Gospel of John, and he noticed a massive problem. The Greek style, the vocabulary, and the grammatical construction of the Apocalypse are radically, jarringly different from the Gospel. The Gospel of John is written in smooth, relatively simple, beautiful Greek. The Book of Revelation is full of harsh grammar, broken rules, and strange syntax. Dionysius also pointed out theological differences. The Gospel focuses on eternal life and realized eschatology, the idea that the kingdom is here now. Revelation focuses on future judgment and cosmic war. Dionysius concluded that it is literally impossible for the same human brain to have produced both books. Because Dionysius respected the book's orthodoxy, he couldn't throw it out. So, he theorized that there must have been a second, highly respected Christian leader in Asia Minor who was also named John. Years later, the famous church historian Eusebius seized upon Dionysius's theory and tried to prove it using an obscure quote from our old friend, Papias. In this quote, Papias lists the names of the apostles, including John, and uses the past tense to describe what they said. Then, in the very next breath, Papias mentions a man named Aristion and John the Presbyter, or John the Elder, and uses the present tense to describe what they are saying. Eusebius jumped on this grammar. He said, "Aha! Papias lists John twice. Once with the apostles, and once with the elders. Therefore, there are two Johns. John the apostle wrote the gospel, and John the elder wrote the crazy apocalyptic book." Eusebius even spread a rumor that there were two separate tombs in Ephesus for the two Johns. This John the Elder hypothesis is still incredibly popular in secular academia today. But is it true? Thomas Schreiner and other conservative scholars argue that Eusebius made a massive, biased mistake. When you study Papias's vocabulary, you realize he uses the word elder as a synonym for apostle. Why does Papias list John twice? It is all about the verb tenses. Papias uses the past tense for the other apostles because they were already dead. He uses the present tense for John the Elder because, at the time Papias was collecting his data, John was the only apostle who was still physically alive. John was the living and surviving voice. Therefore, John the Apostle and John the Elder are the exact same person. We even see this in the biblical text itself, where the author of 2nd and 3rd John simply calls himself the Elder. We must also remember that Eusebius was highly biased. He absolutely despised the idea of a literal millennium. He thought it was a crude, materialistic doctrine. Because he hated the theology of Revelation 20, Eusebius had a massive theological motive to strip the book of its apostolic authority. The John the Elder hypothesis, therefore, is built on a shaky grammatical misunderstanding and theological prejudice. If we accept the historical tradition that the Apostle John wrote both the Gospel and the Apocalypse, we are still left with the massive problem raised by Dionysius: how do we explain the terrible Greek grammar in Revelation? This remains the single most formidable barrier to apostolic authorship in modern scholarship. However, conservative scholars offer a robust, multifaceted defense that explains these stylistic discrepancies without needing to invent a second author. Let us look at three primary explanations. The first explanation is rooted in genre and experience. Think about the psychological state of the author. The Gospel of John is a text of serene, profound theological reflection, written after decades of meditation on the life of Christ. Revelation, however, is an apocalypse. It is the raw, ecstatic recording of overwhelming, terrifying cosmic visions. If you are describing dragons sweeping stars from the sky and multi-headed beasts rising from the sea, your language is naturally going to fracture and stretch beyond the bounds of polite, standard grammar. The form matches the chaotic nature of the vision. The second, and perhaps most fascinating, explanation is advanced by scholars like Adela Yarbrough Collins and G. K. Beale. They argue that the bad grammar is not an accident, it is deliberate. John was bilingual. He thought in Hebrew and Aramaic, but wrote in Greek. Beale argues extensively that John intentionally wrote in Semitizing Greek. He purposefully broke Greek grammatical rules to create what we call solecisms. Why? Because every time he broke a rule, it acted like a flashing neon sign pointing the sophisticated reader back to a specific Old Testament prophecy. He was forcing the Greek language to bend to Hebrew theological categories. It is a work of subversive literary genius, not ignorance. The third explanation is purely practical and circumstantial. In the ancient world, prominent leaders rarely physically wrote their own documents, they dictated them to highly trained professional scribes known as an amanuensis. It is highly probable that when John wrote the Gospel in the comfort of the Ephesian church, he used a skilled Greek secretary who polished his syntax. But Revelation was written under vastly different circumstances. John was a prisoner, exiled to the penal colony on the rocky island of Patmos. He did not have his theological library, and he certainly did not have a professional Greek scribe. He wrote it himself, in his own rough, second-language Greek. What about the theological differences? Critics argue that the Gospel is a book of love, while Revelation is a book of violent hatred. Thomas Schreiner argues that this is a completely false dichotomy. If you read the Gospel of John carefully, it is filled with stark warnings of absolute judgment for those who reject the light. And conversely, if you read Revelation closely, it is profoundly focused on salvation, grace, and believers washing their robes in the cleansing blood of the Lamb. Furthermore, only the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation use the specific, profound theological title, the Word of God, for Jesus Christ, and both extensively feature the imagery of Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. When we weigh the evidence, the differences in style and grammar are perfectly accounted for by the genre, the use of Old Testament allusions, and the harsh conditions of Patmos. Therefore, there is no compelling internal reason to reject the overwhelming testimony of the early church that the Apostle John is the author. For our final topic in this introductory seminar, we must attempt to situate the Apocalypse in time. When exactly did John write this book? As with everything in Revelation, the answer requires careful historical detective work. When we read the text, we are immediately struck by its historical vagueness. John never gives us a date stamp. He never explicitly names the Roman emperor currently on the throne. As Thomas Schreiner notes, this vagueness is actually a profound hermeneutical instruction for us. It warns us not to rigidly chain the book's theology to one hyperspecific political moment. The message transcends the immediate circumstances. However, scholars generally debate between two primary dates, an early date during the reign of the psychotic Emperor Nero, around the 60s AD, and a later date during the reign of Emperor Domitian, in the mid-90s AD. Let us examine the Neronian hypothesis first. Many scholars prefer this early date because of the intense, bloody persecution initiated by Nero against Christians in Rome. They also point to two internal texts. First, in chapter 17, John talks about 7 kings, saying, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. If you start counting Caesars from Julius or Augustus, you can manipulate the math to make Nero the 6th king. Second, and more importantly, in chapter 11, John is told to measure the temple. Early date advocates argue this proves the physical Jewish temple in Jerusalem was still standing, meaning the book absolutely had to be written before the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD. While this sounds compelling, Schreiner systematically dismantles these arguments. First, the historical record shows that Nero's maniacal persecution of Christians was entirely localized to the city of Rome. He used them as scapegoats for the Great Fire. There is zero historical evidence that Nero authorized any systemic persecution of Christians in the province of Asia Minor, where John's churches were located. Second, trying to calculate the 7 kings in chapter 17 is a fool's errand. Depending on who you count as a legitimate emperor, you get wildly different results. It is far better to read the 7 kings as a symbol of the totality of oppressive world empires. Finally, regarding the temple in chapter 11, every other time the word temple or holy city is used in the book of Revelation, it is used symbolically to refer to the church or the heavenly sanctuary. It never refers to the literal, terrestrial building made of stone in Jerusalem. Therefore, using chapter 11 to demand a pre-70 AD date is exegetically unsound. This brings us to the Domitianic hypothesis, placing the book in the 90s AD. The foundation for this date rests, once again, on our most reliable historical witness, Irenaeus. Writing in the late 2nd century, Irenaeus discusses the identity of the Antichrist. In doing so, he explicitly states that the apocalyptic vision was not seen a long time ago, but quote, almost in our own generation towards the end of the reign of Domitian. Some early-date advocates try to twist the Greek grammar of Irenaeus to say that John was seen at the end of Domitian's reign, not the vision itself. But this is incredibly awkward syntax. The most natural, academically rigorous reading of the text is that the Book of Revelation was published while Domitian was emperor. This later date perfectly aligns with the rise of the imperial cult in Asia Minor. By the 90s AD, the social and economic pressure on Christians to worship the emperor as a god had reached a boiling point. The subtle seduction of Roman wealth and the threat of social ostracization under Domitian provide the perfect, explosive socio-political backdrop for John's fiery, prophetic warnings. And with this historical foundation laid, we are now ready to plunge into the text of the Apocalypse itself. The hermeneutical challenge, apocalyptic imagery and the evocation of emotion. Welcome back to our advanced seminar. In this session, we are diving deep into the core arguments regarding the interpretation, authorship, and historical setting of the Book of Revelation. We must first address the hermeneutical challenge presented by the book's intense, often bewildering imagery. Thomas Schreiner points out a fascinating observation from St. Augustine, who argued that the dense and dark fog wrapping some passages is actually due to divine providence, designed to break human pride with hard labor and to save the intelligence from boredom. Let us unpack that together. Imagine you are a brilliant scholar in the ancient world, accustomed to the pristine, logical syllogisms of Greek philosophy or the straightforward legal codes of the Roman Empire. You approach the Book of Revelation, expecting a systematic treatise on end-times theology, but instead, you are hit with a barrage of multi-headed beasts, cosmic judgments, and bleeding moons. Augustine is suggesting that God deliberately inspired this bewildering format to humble the intellectual elite. The text resists mastery. It forces the reader to slow down, to struggle, and to depend on the spirit rather than mere analytical prowess. The obscurity is not a flaw in John's writing, it is a divine pedagogical strategy. Then we must consider another profound point from our text. Schreiner, echoing the scholar Adela Yarbrough Collins, notes that the book creates a virtual experience for the hearer or reader, skillfully handling their thoughts and feelings through effective symbols. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about how modern virtual reality works. It bypasses mere intellectual understanding and places your entire sensory system into a new world. John didn't have computer technology, but he had apocalyptic imagery. He was writing to believers in the province of Asia who were being slowly seduced by the wealth and power of Rome. If he just wrote a letter saying, "Rome is bad, do not love money," they might have nodded and ignored him. Instead, he paints a picture of a seductive harlot drinking the blood of the saints, riding a terrifying beast. He creates a virtual reality that shocks their system. As the author Flannery O'Connor eloquently put it regarding her own fiction, to the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind you draw large and startling figures. John had to use violent, shocking imagery to wake up a church that was comfortably falling asleep in the lap of the empire. This leads us to a crucial historical observation. Schreiner notes that Carl Jung and D.H. Lawrence fiercely criticized Revelation, with Jung calling it a veritable orgy of hatred and blind destructive fury. How should we respond to this modern revulsion? Jung and Lawrence completely missed the pastoral necessity of apocalyptic shock. They read the judgment scenes as the psychological projections of a resentful, drug-addicted madman. But they failed to realize that to a community facing the suffocating, unyielding propaganda of the Roman imperial cult, polite theological essays are useless. The violence in Revelation is a profound literary unmasking of the violence inherent in the empire itself. John is tearing away the civilized veneer of Rome to show the demonic beast beneath. The imagery is multicolored, ambivalent, and offensive because reality itself is fraught with this cosmic tension. As we study this book, we must allow its startling figures to shout at us, to wake us up from our own cultural assimilation, and to reshape our emotional commitments to the slain lamb. Paradigms of Interpretation Part 1, Preterist and Historicist Models. Now that we have established the emotional and visionary nature of the book, we must examine the lenses through which scholars have historically interpreted it. Thomas Schreiner expertly breaks down the four major interpretive paradigms, starting with the preterist approach. The preterist reading situates the message of the book in the 1st century, emphasizing that the book was written for the 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia. Let us unpack that together. The great strength of the preterist model is that it takes the original audience seriously. It refuses to treat Revelation as a secret code written exclusively for people living 2,000 years later. It recognizes that John was a real pastor writing to real people in a real place. However, there is a significant flaw in how some evangelical preterists apply this view. Many try to force all the prophecies of Revelation into the events of the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. But think about the geographical and demographic reality. The 7 churches were located in the western part of modern-day Turkey. Many, if not most, of the believers there were Gentiles. Why would the local destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem be the ultimate, cosmic vindication of their faith? Furthermore, the judgments depicted in Revelation draw heavily from the book of Daniel, chapters 2 and 7, which envision the universal judgment of pagan empires, not just a localized judgment on Israel. Therefore, while we must retain the preterist focus on the original context, we cannot restrict the book's massive, cosmic scope to a single event in Judea. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding the second major paradigm, the historicist view. Schreiner notes that the historicist view reads Revelation as a prophecy or chart of history, a perspective that took off in the Middle Ages but has waned since then. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about how tempting it is to map the symbols of Revelation onto the timeline of human history. The Venerable Bede in the 8th century argued that the first 4 seals represented the first 400 years of church history. Later, some interpreters would say the Church of Thyatira represents the Dark Ages, and Laodicea represents the modern liberal church. It sounds incredibly insightful at first glance. It gives the reader a sense of controlling history, of knowing exactly where we are on the prophetic timeline. But Schreiner offers a devastating critique of this method. He argues that this sketch of history is artificial, forced, and arbitrary, pointing out that the book would not make much sense for the original readers if it was mainly intended for later ages. Imagine receiving a letter from your pastor, filled with urgent warnings and glorious promises, only to discover that it actually describes the Protestant Reformation 1500 years in the future. It would be entirely useless to you in your present suffering under Roman oppression. Therefore, while historicism dominated the minds of brilliant men like Martin Luther and Isaac Newton, it fundamentally violates the pastoral nature of the book. We must interpret Revelation in a way that would have been deeply meaningful to a first-century believer in Ephesus or Smyrna, while still holding cosmic significance for the consummation of all things. Paradigms of Interpretation Part 2, Futurist, Idealist, and Eclectic Synthesis. We now turn our attention to the remaining interpretive paradigms discussed by Thomas Schreiner, beginning with the futurist view. Schreiner states that futurist interpreters see the book as a prophecy of future events, looking forward to the wrapping up of history with the coming of Jesus Christ. Let us unpack that together. The futurist view is perhaps the most well-known approach in the modern Western Church, largely due to the influence of dispensationalism and popular fiction series. This view correctly recognizes that Revelation is driving toward a massive, cosmic climax, the return of Christ, the final judgment, and the new heavens and new earth. It takes the eschatological promises of God seriously. However, Schreiner raises a critical red flag. Just like the historicist view, the futurist reading fails to clearly explain the book's significance for the original readers. If chapters 4 through 22 are exclusively about events happening in the 21st century or beyond, then John essentially wrote a confusing, irrelevant document to 7 suffering churches in the ancient world. Furthermore, Schreiner warns against the trap of newspaper eschatology. Think about how many times over the last century popular teachers have identified the beast as a specific modern dictator, or the mark of the beast as a specific new technology like barcodes or microchips. Because this approach ties the symbols to current events, the interpretation has to constantly change every time the political headlines change. It is an unstable, capricious way to read the sacred text. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding the idealist view. Schreiner notes that the idealist view sees general principles and truths in the book but does not anchor the text to history in any definite way. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about the timeless battle between good and evil. The idealist looks at the beast and does not see Rome, or a future dictator, but rather the spirit of oppressive government in any age. They look at Babylon and see the seductive nature of worldliness in every culture. The great advantage of this view is that it never becomes outdated, it applies beautifully to all readers at all times. But the fatal weakness is that it tends to sever the text from the historical context in which Revelation was birthed. John was not writing a generic philosophical allegory, he was writing to specific Christians facing specific pressures from the imperial cult and local trade guilds. If we completely spiritualize the text, we lose the grit and reality of the first-century struggle. This brings us to Schreiner's ultimate conclusion on the matter. He argues that the best approach borrows from all these perspectives. We must engage in an eclectic synthesis. We must read Revelation as a letter firmly rooted in the first-century Roman Empire. That is the preterist truth. We must recognize that its ultimate fulfillment awaits the glorious, physical return of Jesus Christ. That is the futurist truth. We must extract the timeless theological principles regarding God's sovereignty and the nature of spiritual warfare. That is the idealist truth. And we must acknowledge that its message speaks prophetically to the Church in every generation between the first and the final coming. That is the historicist truth. By holding these together, we honor the depth and complexity of the apocalyptic genre. Early patristic reception and the chiliastic debates. As we continue our historical survey of how Revelation has been understood, we dive into the turbulent waters of the early Church Fathers. Thomas Schreiner points out that in the 2nd century, Papias of Hierapolis gleaned from Revelation chapter 20 that a world was coming in which nature would produce abundant fruit and food, beginning a golden age of prosperity on earth. Let us unpack that together. The earliest interpretations of Revelation were heavily literal regarding the 1,000-year reign of Christ, a view known as chiliasm. Papias, relying on oral traditions, envisioned an earthly kingdom where vines would have 10,000 branches, and every grape would yield massive quantities of wine. It was a very physical, earthly hope. But this intense focus on an earthly utopia quickly became problematic. A charismatic sect known as the Montanists arose, and their eschatological enthusiasm reached fever pitch. They literally believed that Jesus was going to return and establish the New Jerusalem in a small town called Papusa in Phrygia. This geographical fixation and eschatological extreme created a massive controversy in the early church. The situation grew so intense that some Orthodox leaders decided the only way to stop the Montanist madness was to throw the book of Revelation out of the Bible altogether. A churchman named Gaius of Rome was so disturbed by this earthly millennialism that he claimed the book was a forgery, written not by the Apostle John, but by a notorious heretic named Cerinthus. Think about the irony here. A book given to comfort the church almost tore it apart because of how fiercely people debated its literal application. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding how the church resolved this crisis. Schreiner introduces us to Tychonius, writing around the year 400, who maintained that the millennium represents the period between Christ's first and second coming. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about the monumental shift this represents. Tychonius, followed closely by the great theologian St. Augustine, completely spiritualized the 1,000-year reign. They argued that Satan is currently bound, prevented from totally destroying the church, and that believers enter the millennial reign the moment they are baptized into Christ. This interpretation, known today as amillennialism, was a game-changer. By moving the millennium from a future earthly utopia to a present spiritual reality, Tychonius and Augustine essentially saved the book of Revelation for the Western Church. They made it safe. It was no longer a dangerous manual for radical sects waiting for a physical kingdom in Turkey. It became a profound theological text about the ongoing conflict between the city of God and the city of man. This Augustinian framework would go on to dominate biblical interpretation for over 1,000 years, demonstrating how the historical pressures of an era can radically reshape the way the Church reads apocalyptic literature. Medieval to Reformation appropriations of the Apocalypse. Moving forward into the Middle Ages, the Book of Revelation undergoes a radical transformation in how it is utilized by the Church. Thomas Schreiner points out that Joachim of Fiore, historically one of the most influential interpreters of the book, advocated a historicist interpretation, warning that a future pope might be the Antichrist. Let us unpack that together. Joachim was a 12th-century monk who looked at the sweeping narrative of Scripture and divided all of human history into 3 overlapping epochs, corresponding to the Trinity. The Old Testament was the age of the Father, the New Testament was the age of the Son, and Joachim believed his own era was transitioning into the age of the Holy Spirit. He looked at the moral decay of the institutional church and began to calculate where they were in the 7 seals. This was incredibly dangerous, revolutionary thinking. By suggesting that the ultimate enemy of God, the Antichrist, could actually sit on the papal throne, Joachim unleashed an interpretive framework that would shake Europe to its foundations. Suddenly, the beast of Revelation was not some ancient Roman emperor, the beast could be the Pope himself. As the Franciscan monks embraced vows of absolute poverty, they looked at the immense wealth and military power of the papacy and concluded that the institutional church was Babylon the Great. Kings and popes began hurling the title of Antichrist at one another as a political weapon. It was the ultimate theological smear campaign. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding the Reformation era. Schreiner states that Martin Luther, early in his ministry, lamented that the book didn't reveal Christ and wasn't of great value, complaining that it lacked the clarity we see in the writings of Peter and Paul. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about Luther's core theology. For Luther, the entire Bible was about justification by faith alone in the cross of Jesus Christ. When he read Revelation, he didn't see the cross clearly, he saw bizarre monsters, cryptic numbers, and visions of wrath. He famously said that Christ is neither taught nor known in it. However, as the political and theological battle with Rome intensified, Luther's perspective shifted dramatically. He realized that the medieval historicist reading of Revelation was the perfect weapon against his enemies. He began to enthusiastically endorse the view that the papacy was the definitive fulfillment of the Antichrist. But this apocalyptic fervor could not be easily controlled. While Luther used the book for theological debate, radical Anabaptists like Thomas Müntzer claimed direct revelation from the Spirit and used the violent imagery of the apocalypse to justify taking up physical swords against the nobility in the horrific Peasants' War. It serves as a grim reminder that when apocalyptic literature is severed from careful, historical grammatical exegesis, it can easily become a manifesto for violent social revolution. The history of Revelation is truly written in the blood of its interpreters. The authorship question, the visionary identity of John. Having surveyed the centuries of interpretive history, we must now ask the foundational critical questions regarding the text itself. Who wrote this astonishing book? Thomas Schreiner points out that most apocalypses are pseudonymous, but Revelation stands out as an exception, as the author clearly identifies himself as John and reports that he was on the island of Patmos. Let us unpack that together. In the ancient Jewish world, if you wanted to write an apocalypse, it was standard practice to use a pen name. You would attribute your visions to ancient heroes of the faith, like Enoch, Moses, or Baruch, to give your writing instant authority. But the author of Revelation does not do this. He simply introduces himself as John. Furthermore, he grounds his visions in empirical reality. Schreiner notes that John tells us he saw things 45 times, and heard things 43 times. He is presenting a verisimilitude, a truthful account of a genuine visionary experience. He is not making up a fictional story, he is acting as a faithful witness to a staggering divine encounter. The internal evidence of the book tells us a great deal about this man. He was undoubtedly a Palestinian Jew. His mind is absolutely saturated with the Hebrew Scriptures. He doesn't quote the Old Testament formally, rather, he weaves its language into every single sentence. He knows the intricacies of the Jerusalem temple rituals, and he writes in a Greek style that is heavily influenced by Hebrew syntax. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding the specific identity of this John. Schreiner states that while most modern critical scholars believe the author is an unknown John, he holds the minority view that John the Apostle wrote the book, arguing that an unattributed reference to John most naturally refers to the Apostle. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about the dynamics of authority in the first-century church. This author is writing to 7 massive, influential churches in Asia Minor, including the church in Ephesus, which was a major theological hub. He is writing with breathtaking authority. He commands them, he rebukes them, he warns them of divine judgment. If this was just some random, unknown prophet named John, the congregations would likely have demanded to know his credentials. By what authority do you speak to us like this? The fact that he simply calls himself John, assuming that every believer in the province of Asia will immediately know exactly who he is and submit to his authority, strongly implies that he is a figure of unparalleled stature. He is the last surviving member of the inner circle of Jesus Christ. Only the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, could write with such unadorned, absolute authority. The patristic chain of custody, Irenaeus and apostolic authorship. When we examine the historical evidence outside the Bible for who wrote Revelation, we find something quite extraordinary. Thomas Schreiner points out that the early tradition supporting apostolic authorship of Revelation is among the strongest among the New Testament books, with Justin Martyr identifying John the Apostle as the author as early as the middle of the 2nd century. Let us unpack that together. In the court of historical inquiry, eyewitness testimony and unbroken chains of custody are the gold standard. When we look at the early church fathers, we do not find vague rumors about who wrote Revelation. We find firm, geographical, and relational certainty. Justin Martyr, a brilliant philosopher and apologist, lived for a time in Ephesus, the very city where John spent his final years, and Justin explicitly names the Apostle John as the visionary of Patmos. But the most crucial witness in this historical defense is a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus unequivocally declared that the same John who laid his head on the chest of Jesus at the Last Supper, the same John who wrote the magnificent 4th Gospel, is the exact same man who saw the terrifying visions of the Apocalypse. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding how Irenaeus knew this information. Schreiner notes that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was himself a disciple of John the Apostle, and Irenaeus emphasizes that he memorized some of what Polycarp taught and often meditated upon the latter's teaching. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about the immense weight of this relational chain. We are not talking about oral traditions passed down through hundreds of anonymous people over centuries, like a game of telephone. We are talking about 2 links. Jesus taught John. John taught Polycarp. Polycarp taught Irenaeus. Some modern critical scholars try to dismiss this evidence by arguing that Irenaeus was just a little boy when he heard Polycarp speak, and therefore his memory is unreliable. But Schreiner, relying on historical analysis, utterly dismantles this skepticism. Irenaeus did not just have a fleeting encounter with Polycarp. The Greek verbs used to describe their relationship indicate that Irenaeus sat under Polycarp's teaching continuously and systematically memorized his apostolic doctrines. Irenaeus cherished the physical memory of how Polycarp looked, how he walked, and the stories he told about his time with the Apostle John. Therefore, when Irenaeus tells us that the Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation, he is not guessing. He is passing on the direct, unassailable historical memory of the Asian Church. To reject apostolic authorship, one must arrogantly assume that modern scholars sitting in a library 2,000 years later know more about the origins of the Ephesian Church than the men who actually lived there and bled for it. Deconstructing the Elder John hypothesis. As we dig deeper into the authorship debate, we encounter a very popular theory held by many modern scholars. Thomas Schreiner points out that Eusebius of Caesarea attributed the book to John the Elder on the basis of Papias' testimony, stating there were 2 different tombs in Ephesus, one for the apostle and one for the elder. Let us unpack that together. Where did this idea of a second, lesser John come from? To understand this, we have to understand the motives of the great church historian, Eusebius. As we discussed earlier, Eusebius absolutely despised the chiliastic, literal earthly millennial views that were circulating in the church. Because the book of Revelation was the primary source text for these millennial views, Eusebius was highly motivated to distance the book from the Apostle John. He didn't want to throw it out of the Bible entirely, but he wanted to downgrade its authority. So, he scoured the ancient archives and found a quote from Papias. In this quote, Papias lists several apostles, including John, and then in the very next breath, he mentions what Aristion and the presbyter John are saying. Eusebius triumphantly declared, "Aha! Papias names John twice. Therefore, there must be two different men named John in Ephesus. This elder John must be the author of Revelation, not the great apostle." Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding the fatal flaw in Eusebius' logic. Schreiner dismantles this theory, arguing that Eusebius probably misinterpreted Papias' words, and that the verb tenses in the Greek are vital. Papias refers to what the elders said in the past, but when John comes up the second time, he refers to what they say in the present. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about a modern historian doing interviews. If I say, I studied what Abraham Lincoln and George Washington said, and I am also studying what living presidents are saying, I am not implying the existence of two different men with the same name. I am distinguishing between the dead and the living. When Papias wrote his document, Peter, Andrew, Philip, and Thomas were all dead. That is why Papias used the past tense Greek verb, ipon, to describe what they said. But the Apostle John, who lived to an incredibly old age, was still alive and teaching in Ephesus at the time Papias was gathering his research. That is why Papias switches to the present tense verb, legusin. He mentions John twice not because there are two Johns, but because John belongs in the list of original apostles, and he is also currently the living, breathing source of apostolic truth. There is no phantom elder John. It is a historical fabrication born out of a misunderstanding of grammar and theological bias. The Apostle John and the Elder John are the exact same person. Linguistic and stylistic objections, the Dionysian legacy. We now arrive at what is undeniably the most formidable and serious objection to the Apostle John writing this book. Thomas Schreiner notes that Dionysius of Alexandria contested apostolic authorship on the basis of the literary style of the book, claiming that the grammar of Revelation isn't consistent with the fourth Gospel or the three Johannine epistles. Let us unpack that together. Dionysius was a brilliant scholar in the 3rd century, and he essentially invented historical critical literary analysis. He read the Gospel of John and saw smooth, elegant, relatively simple Greek. He read the themes of love, light, and eternal life. Then he read the book of Revelation, and from a grammatical standpoint, it was a disaster. The Greek of Revelation is full of broken rules, mismatched cases, and what scholars call solecisms, which are essentially severe grammatical errors. Dionysius argued, and many modern scholars agree, that it is psychologically and linguistically impossible for the man who wrote the polished gospel to have written the chaotic apocalypse. The difference in vocabulary and theology is just too massive. This is a very weighty argument that we must take seriously. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding how conservative scholars respond to this dilemma. Schreiner suggests that perhaps the grammar and style are best accounted for by the apocalyptic genre, the visionary character of the Revelation, or the fact that John didn't have a secretary when writing Revelation as he perhaps did with the Gospel. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think about the context of composition. When John wrote his Gospel, he was likely residing comfortably in Ephesus, surrounded by a community of believers. He had the time to draft, edit, and refine his theological masterpiece, likely utilizing a skilled Greek secretary, known as an amanuensis, to polish the prose. But when he wrote Revelation, he was a prisoner of the Roman Empire, exiled to the desolate penal colony of Patmos. He was likely writing under extreme duress, recording mind-shattering visions of cosmic warfare without the luxury of an editor. Furthermore, scholars like G.K. Beale have pointed out that many of John's grammatical errors are not actually mistakes, they are deliberate literary devices. When John breaks a Greek grammar rule, he is often doing it intentionally to draw the reader's attention to an Old Testament Hebrew allusion. He is consciously writing in a prophetic, Septuagintal style, mimicking the cadence of the ancient Hebrew prophets to signal that he is speaking with the same divine authority. When we account for the radical difference in genre, the brutal circumstances of his exile, and his deliberate prophetic styling, the stylistic differences are entirely understandable. They do not disprove apostolic authorship, rather, they illuminate the intense, ecstatic reality of his visionary experience on Patmos. The dating conundrum, Neronic versus Domitianic contexts. Finally, as we conclude our examination of these introductory historical matters, we must address the complex question of when exactly the Book of Revelation was written. Thomas Schreiner points out that we are struck by its vagueness in terms of the historical setting, and therefore establishes a crucial rule: no interpretation should be accepted that demands a particular date. Let us unpack that together. The debate over the dating of Revelation is not just academic trivia, it fundamentally shapes how you interpret the symbols. There are two primary camps. The early date camp believes the book was written during the reign of the psychotic Emperor Nero, sometime before the year 70. The late date camp believes it was written during the reign of Emperor Domitian, near the end of the 1st century. Those who argue for the early date lean heavily on internal clues. For example, they point to Revelation chapter 11, where John is told to measure the temple of God. They argue, quite logically, that John could only be told to measure the temple if the physical temple in Jerusalem was still standing. Since the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70, the book must have been written before that catastrophe. But Schreiner demonstrates the fatal flaw in this literalistic reading. Throughout the entirety of Revelation, John never uses the word temple to refer to a building of stone and wood in the Middle East. He always uses it symbolically to refer to the church, the heavenly sanctuary, or the presence of God himself. To suddenly read chapter 11 as a literal architectural blueprint violates the established symbolic language of the book. Then we must consider another profound point from our text regarding the historical evidence for the late date. Schreiner relies on the earliest external evidence we have, quoting Irenaeus, who stated that the vision was seen almost in our own generation towards the end of the reign of Domitian. What does this mean for our hermeneutic? Well, think back to our previous discussion on the chain of custody. If Irenaeus, who was trained by Polycarp, explicitly states that the Apostle John received his visions while Domitian was the Emperor of Rome, that carries immense historical weight. Therefore, while we must remain flexible and avoid locking our theology into a rigid timeline, the balance of historical probability overwhelmingly favors a date in the 90s. John was an old man, exiled by a tyrannical Roman administration, writing to a network of churches that were exhausted by decades of quiet compromise and cultural pressure. He writes to pull back the curtain, to reveal the true terrifying nature of the empire, and to assure the weary saints that the slaughtered lamb is securely on the throne, sovereignly guiding human history to its glorious, triumphant consummation. Synthesizing interpretive frameworks for modern application. The approach in this commentary borrows from all these perspectives. Even the historicist perspective rightly perceives the book as speaking to later generations. As we begin the concluding and applicational portion of our seminar today, we must deeply understand that interpreting the book of Revelation requires a rich, multidimensional hermeneutic. We cannot simply lock ourselves into a single, rigid paradigm. The preterist view rightly grounds us in the 1st century, forcing us to ask what these symbols meant to the suffering congregations in Smyrna or the wealthy and complacent believers in Laodicea. The futurist view reminds us of the ultimate eschatological horizon, the final wrap-up of human history. The idealist view extracts the timeless theological principles regarding the battle between good and evil, and even the often discarded historicist view reminds us that God is sovereign over all eras of church history. Imagine trying to view a magnificent, multifaceted diamond through only one lens or under a single, narrow beam of light. You would capture its brilliance in one specific dimension, but you would inevitably miss the profound depth and the refracting colors that emerge when it is turned and viewed from multiple angles. This is exactly what happens when modern interpreters rigidly adhere to only one school of thought. It flattens the text. We end up fighting over timelines instead of falling on our faces in worship. Since there is some truth in all four views, we need to consider the historical context, future fulfillment, and ongoing truths as we examine John's message. This eclectic methodology proposed by Thomas Schreiner is not a compromise. Rather, it is an intellectually robust and spiritually enriching approach to biblical interpretation. When applying Revelation to the modern church, we must first tether our understanding to the province of Asia in the 1st century. Once that anchor is firmly set, preventing us from inventing wild, anachronistic theories, we are then free to extract the overarching principles of divine justice, the absolute sovereignty of the Lamb, and the ultimate defeat of systemic evil. Finally, we must cast our gaze forward, recognizing that the promise of a new heaven and a new earth is not merely a symbolic comfort for a difficult day, but a literal, future reality that sustains believers who are facing intense persecution today. This multidimensional approach is absolutely essential for any scholar, teacher, or pastor who wishes to present Revelation not as a bizarre puzzle to be decoded, but as a profound theological masterpiece designed to secure the faith of the saints across every single generation until Christ returns. Reclaiming the pastoral purpose of apocalyptic imagery. John handles skillfully the hearer's thoughts, attitudes, and feelings by the use of effective symbols and a narrative plot that invites imaginative participation. When we look closely at this quotation by Adela Yarbrough Collins, we begin to uncover one of the most vital principles for practically applying these apocalyptic visions to modern ecclesiastical life. The idea that John is creating a virtual experience is not merely an interesting literary observation, it is a profoundly pastoral strategy. Think deeply about the cultural waters in which the early Christians were swimming. They lived in an environment saturated with the imposing architecture, the intimidating military parades, and the inescapable imperial cult of the mighty Roman Empire. The visual rhetoric of Rome was explicitly designed to project absolute, invincible power, subtly conditioning the inhabitants of Asia Minor to believe that Caesar was Lord and that resistance was not only futile, but completely absurd. To counter this overwhelming visual and cultural indoctrination, John could not simply offer dry, propositional, logical arguments. He needed a medium that could completely bypass their cognitive defenses and directly assault their culturally conditioned imaginations. This is precisely what apocalyptic imagery accomplishes. It functions like a spiritual defibrillator, delivering a shocking jolt to an imagination that has been numbed by the world. The imagery has a pastoral purpose and it stirs up the emotions for a reason. It is the emotions affected that shape people's commitments and actions and encourage faithfulness to God, Christ, and the Christian community. Building on this profound insight by K. Huber, we must realize that when John presents the seemingly invincible Roman Empire not as a glorious civilization bringing peace, but as a grotesque, multi-headed beast emerging from the chaotic sea, he is fundamentally subverting the imperial propaganda. He is pulling back the curtain on reality, allowing the church to see the demonic spiritual forces animating the state. For us today, the application is incredibly urgent and relevant. Our modern congregations are similarly bombarded by the visual and cultural liturgies of secularism, consumerism, and state power. Our imaginations are discipled daily by screens that present the pursuit of wealth, comfort, and absolute personal autonomy as the ultimate human goods. We desperately need the shocking, vibrant, and even violent imagery of Revelation to break us out of our stupor. We need to see the spiritual reality behind the geopolitical and cultural movements of our day. The pastor or scholar who merely dissects these images academically, carefully categorizing beasts and bulls on a whiteboard without allowing them to function as pastoral shock therapy, completely fails to utilize the text as God intended. We must invite our people into this virtual experience, allowing the Holy Spirit to recalibrate their affections, their loyalties, and their understanding of true, lasting power. Engaging the detractors, vindication versus vengeance. Carl Jung said the God of Revelation represents an unheard-of fury of destruction against the human race. This shocking critique from one of the most famous psychologists of the 20th century forces us to confront a profound discomfort that many modern people have with the final book of the Bible. Throughout church history, Revelation has faced fierce opposition. Even the great reformer Martin Luther initially struggled with it, claiming it did not clearly reveal Christ. But the modern secular critiques are far more acidic. Intellectuals look at the blood, the plagues, and the winepress of God's wrath, and they recoil. They accuse John of being driven by deep psychological resentment. They claim that because the early Christians were politically powerless and socially marginalized, they invented a violent fantasy where their oppressors are brutally slaughtered. In this skeptical view, Revelation is not divine inspiration, it is just the toxic revenge fantasy of the oppressed. As scholars and leaders, we must rigorously dismantle this false narrative. Resentment and not love is the teaching of the Revelation of St. John the Divine. It is a book without wisdom, goodness, kindness, or affection of any kind. When we hear this famous accusation by literary critic Harold Bloom, we must recognize that it is based on a fundamentally flawed understanding of the nature of true justice. The detractors completely misdiagnose the theological heartbeat of apocalyptic judgment. The Book of Revelation is not an exercise in human vindictiveness. It does not tell Christians to take up swords and overthrow the Roman government. Instead, it is a profound theodicy, a defense of God's perfect goodness in a world overflowing with evil. Think of the martyrs under the altar in Revelation chapter 6, crying out, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" This is not a petty cry for personal revenge. It is a cosmic demand for moral equilibrium. It is a plea for God to act like God. If God looks at the systemic slaughter of the innocent, the exploitation of the poor by the Babylonian Empire, and the horrific abuses of human history, and decides to do absolutely nothing, then God is not truly good. The judgment texts in Revelation, the breaking of the seals, the sounding of the trumpets, and the pouring out of the bowls, serve to vindicate the holiness of God. They prove that evil will not have the final word. Furthermore, as Thomas Schreiner points out, critics try to build a wall between the Jesus of the Gospels who loves, and the Christ of Revelation who judges. But this is a false dichotomy. True love violently opposes anything that seeks to destroy the beloved. The wrath of the Lamb is the fierce, protective love of a bridegroom coming to rescue his bride. Therefore, our application today must be bold. We must not apologize for the wrath of God. We must preach it as the ultimate guarantee that all the wrongs of human history will be definitively and perfectly righted. The original audience as the primary hermeneutical anchor. Urania is not a preterist, but she rightly observes that we as readers should recognize that John writes to real places, he does not construct an imaginary recipient. This is an absolutely foundational principle for anyone seeking to responsibly teach and apply the Book of Revelation. It is so easy for modern readers to treat the Apocalypse as if it were a timeless, floating document filled with abstract codes dropped straight out of heaven into the 21st century. But we must remember that Revelation is fundamentally a letter. It has a specific sender, and it has specific, historical recipients. John is writing to 7 literal, geographically located churches in the Roman province of Asia, which is modern-day Turkey. These believers were not imaginary, and their struggles were not theoretical. They were navigating incredibly complex cultural and economic pressures. To survive economically, you had to join a local trade guild. But these guilds were deeply intertwined with pagan idolatry. Their meetings required eating meat sacrificed to local deities and pledging allegiance to the divine spirit of the Roman emperor. If you refused to participate because of your exclusive loyalty to Jesus Christ, you faced immediate social ostracization, economic ruin, and potentially even execution. It is within this intense crucible of suffering and compromise that Revelation was birthed. It is difficult to see how the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple would resonate with Christians struggling to handle their own issues in the province of Asia. Here, Thomas Schreiner brilliantly dismantles the popular hyperpreterist view that tries to force the entire Book of Revelation to be nothing more than a prophecy about the Roman army destroying Jerusalem in 70 AD. Think about it logically. The churches in Asia Minor were predominantly Gentile. Why would a highly symbolic book entirely focused on the destruction of a Jewish temple hundreds of miles away offer profound spiritual comfort and challenge to a Gentile believer in Pergamum who is being threatened with a sword for refusing to burn incense to Caesar? It simply does not make historical or pastoral sense. Therefore, if we want to apply Revelation powerfully to our churches today, we must follow a strict trajectory. We must first rigorously exegete the text in its original context. We must ask, how did this specific vision of the slaughtered lamb fortify a first-century believer in Smyrna facing poverty and slander? Only after we have firmly grasped the historical anchor can we legitimately draw the line forward to the present day. We can then ask, how does this same vision fortify a 21st-century believer facing modern forms of cultural pressure, political idolatry, and systemic hostility toward the Christian faith? If we bypass the historical reality of the original audience, our application will inevitably become disconnected, capricious, and ultimately unfaithful to the inspired text. The folly of newspaper eschatology. Indeed, some futurist interpreters especially in popular circles fall prey to newspaper eschatology so that the contemporary events become the prism through which Revelation is interpreted. This observation addresses what is arguably the most pervasive and pastorally damaging misapplication of the Book of Revelation in the modern era. While we absolutely must affirm, alongside historic Christian orthodoxy, that Revelation points toward a literal, future eschatological consummation, we have to rigorously critique the wild excesses of popular futurism. For decades, a massive industry of books, seminars, and movies has trained millions of Christians to read the apocalypse with the Bible in one hand and the daily newspaper in the other. They are constantly scanning the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, tracking technological advancements like microchips or digital currencies, and analyzing the speeches of contemporary political figures, desperately trying to decode the symbols of Revelation in real time. But there is a massive theological and logical problem with this methodology. If the terrifying beasts and the apocalyptic judgments exclusively refer to 21st-century technologies and modern geopolitical conflicts, then the Book of Revelation meant absolutely nothing to the persecuted believers in the first century who originally received it. Furthermore, it means the book has been completely irrelevant to the Church for the past 2,000 years, functioning only as a sealed puzzle waiting for the final generation to crack the code. This violates the very nature of biblical revelation, which is meant to edify the Church in every age. The approach is arbitrary and capricious, as everyone who has been paying attention over the years knows, since the interpretation shifts as the headlines change. Schreiner's critique here is devastatingly accurate. If you study the history of this kind of prophetic speculation over the last century, you will see a graveyard of failed predictions. The identity of the Antichrist shifts with every decade depending on who the primary geopolitical enemy of the West happens to be at the time. The mark of the beast has been identified as everything from social security numbers, to barcodes, to credit cards, to vaccines. It is arbitrary and capricious. But the real tragedy is the profound pastoral damage this causes. Newspaper eschatology breeds a culture of fear, anxiety, and endless speculation in the Church. It distracts believers from the clear commands of Christ to make disciples and care for the poor, replacing active obedience with passive chart-making. And worse, when these highly publicized prophetic paradigms inevitably fail, it creates deep cynicism. People walk away not just from the end-times theory, but from the faith entirely, because the authority of the biblical text was irresponsibly tied to a shifting headline. True, faithful application of Revelation demands that we focus our people on the magnificent certainty of Christ's return and his ultimate victory over evil, not on the fragile, speculative decoding of tomorrow's news. The pitfalls of chronological arrogance. Often the state of the seven churches or the seven seals is taken as a chronological forecast of what would happen in history. While we just critique the futurist obsession with modern headlines, we must equally evaluate the historical alternative, which is the historicist paradigm. This view dominated biblical interpretation during the Middle Ages and right through the Protestant Reformation. Historicists read the Book of Revelation as a vast, continuous chronological chart of church history unfolding over centuries. So, for example, the opening of the first few seals might be interpreted as the early barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, while the later trumpet judgments are mapped onto the rise of Islam, and the Antichrist is specifically and exclusively identified as the office of the papacy. While we can certainly understand why reformers facing intense persecution from the institutional church found this reading compelling, it contains a massive exegetically flaw. It turns the Book of Revelation into a secret, coded timeline of primarily Western European history. Thomas Brightman could view the congregations of Sardis, Philadelphia and Laodicea as different branches of the church of his own time, connecting Sardis with the Lutheran Church, Philadelphia with the Calvinist Christians, and Laodicea with the Anglican Church. This historical example provided by Schreiner perfectly illustrates the absurdity that this method ultimately leads to. When you read Revelation this way, you inevitably fall into what we might call chronological arrogance, or hermeneutical narcissism. It is the irresistible temptation of interpreters in every single era of history to map the biblical timeline in such a way that their own generation happens to sit right at the very climax of the story. If you are a Calvinist in the 17th century, like Brightman, you conveniently decide that the faithful Church of Philadelphia represents your own theological camp, while the compromised Church of Laodicea represents your political rivals. This is not exegesis, this is using the Bible as a weapon for your own localized turf wars. The application lesson for the modern church is profound. Even today, you will hear preachers claim that we are currently living in the Laodicean church age, representing the modern, lukewarm Western church. We must firmly reject this approach. Revelation is not a secret blueprint of European or American church history. The symbols and beasts in Revelation are typological, not strictly chronological. This means they are enduring patterns. The dynamics of Babylon, political pride, economic exploitation, and the persecution of the saints, have iterated and repeated themselves in various empires and systems across the globe for 2,000 years. By avoiding chronological arrogance, we allow the text to speak prophetically to every culture in every age. Apostolic authority and the prophetic voice. For I did not suppose that information from books would help me so much as the word of a living and surviving voice. This fascinating quotation from the early church father Papias brings us to the crucial debate regarding the authorship of Revelation. You might wonder why we spend time in a high-level seminar debating whether the Apostle John, or some other unknown guy named John the Elder, wrote this book. Is this just academic trivia? Absolutely not. The question of authorship holds profound implications for the canonical authority and the prophetic weight of the text we are applying to our congregations. Throughout history, starting with figures like Dionysius and Eusebius in the early church, there has been an attempt to distance the book of Revelation from the Apostle John. Why? Often, it was driven by theological bias. Eusebius, for instance, deeply disliked the teaching of a literal millennium found in Revelation chapter 20. So, he utilized a confusing interpretation of Papias's writings to suggest that a second, lesser-known John actually wrote the book, subtly undermining its supreme apostolic authority. But Schreiner carefully dismantles this historical maneuvering. Papias refers to what John the Elder said and what he says because John was the only apostle he heard in person. He heard John's living voice. By conducting a meticulous analysis of the Greek verb tenses used in the historical records, Schreiner demonstrates that Papias was not talking about two different men named John. He was referring to the Apostle John, whom he also called the Elder, celebrating the fact that he was able to hear the living voice of the last surviving apostle. The earliest and most reliable traditions of the Church, including figures like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, enthusiastically received this book as the direct product of the Apostle John. The applicational takeaway for us today is the urgent reclamation of Revelation's supreme apostolic authority. We must not present this book to our churches as the strange, speculative, fever dream musings of an unknown mystic from the 1st century. It is the authoritative, prophetic revelation transmitted by the beloved disciple. When we preach through the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, we are delivering the definitive, final word of the risen Lord Jesus Christ to his bride. It carries the exact same massive theological weight, and demands the exact same rigorous obedience, as the Gospel of John or the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans. We must teach it with absolute, unwavering confidence. The theology of grammatical irregularity. Thus Callahan says that John's solecisms represent a protest against the hegemony of Rome. As we dig deeper into the actual text of Revelation, we encounter a fascinating technical issue that has profound theological implications for how we read the book. In the original Greek, the book of Revelation is famous for having extremely rough, irregular grammar. There are blatant grammatical errors, known as solecisms, scattered throughout the text. For over a century, critical scholars have used this as their primary weapon to argue that the Apostle John could not possibly have written both the smooth, elegant Gospel of John, and this rough, grammatically chaotic apocalypse. Some scholars, like Callahan, propose highly creative sociological explanations, suggesting that intentionally breaking the rules of the Greek language was a subtle form of political protest against the Roman Empire's cultural dominance. While that is a fascinating idea, Thomas Schreiner points us toward a much more robust and satisfying theological explanation. Beale suggests that the grammatical irregularities may be traced to Old Testament allusions. Perhaps the grammar and style are best accounted for by the apocalyptic genre and the visionary character of the Revelation. This insight is an absolute game-changer for biblical interpretation. John is not writing poor Greek because he is uneducated, he is writing what scholars call Semitizing Greek. He is so utterly immersed in the Hebrew Old Testament that he is literally forcing the Greek language to bend and break in order to accommodate Hebrew thought patterns and massive Old Testament allusions. For example, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, John sends greetings from him who is and who was and who is to come. In the Greek language, the preposition from strictly demands that the following nouns be in the genitive case. But John breaks the rule. He deliberately puts the phrase in the nominative case. Why would he make such a blatant grammatical error? Because he is translating the divine name of God from Exodus, Yahweh, the great I Am. John is making a profound theological point: the eternal name of the sovereign God is completely immutable. It cannot be declined, changed, or altered by the grammatical rules of the Roman Empire. What looks like bad grammar is actually breathtakingly brilliant theology. The application for us is paramount. We cannot understand the visions of Revelation by merely analyzing Greco-Roman history. Revelation is the grand climax of the Old Testament. We must teach our congregations to read this book with the prophets Daniel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah wide open on their laps, allowing the Old Testament to interpret the New. The hermeneutical value of historical ambiguity. When we read Revelation, we are struck by its vagueness in terms of the historical setting. Despite the claims of some scholars, nothing in the book itself indisputably points to life under a particular emperor. As we dive into the intense academic debate surrounding the exact date of Revelation's composition, we discover another profound principle for modern application. For centuries, scholars have fiercely argued over whether the book was written early, during the reign of the psychotic Emperor Nero before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, or later, during the oppressive reign of Emperor Domitian toward the end of the 1st century. While Thomas Schreiner compellingly defends the later Domitianic date, relying on the reliable historical testimony of the early church father Irenaeus, he makes a brilliant and liberating observation about the text itself. Unlike many Old Testament prophetic books that begin by giving you a precise timestamp, such as, in the year that King Uzziah died, John deliberately omits the name of the reigning Roman emperor. He does not tell us exactly who is sitting on the throne in Rome. Why? This lack of explicit historical specificity is not a textual defect, and it is not an accident, it is a deliberate, brilliant feature of apocalyptic literature designed by the Holy Spirit. The lack of specificity in the book is instructive for us as readers. We must avoid the rabbit hole of binding our view of Revelation to a specific historical reconstruction. By intentionally leaving the identity of the specific emperor ambiguous, John prevents the church from quarantining the message of the book to the 1st century. If the beast was explicitly and exclusively identified as Nero, then once Nero committed suicide, the church could close the book of Revelation, put it on a museum shelf, and say, well, thank God that is over. But because the text is historically ambiguous, it becomes a dynamic, living prophetic grid that applies to every single generation. The beast certainly represented the tyrannical power of Rome in the 1st century, but because of this divine ambiguity, it equally represented the horrifying totalitarianism of the Third Reich in the 20th century, and it will perfectly describe any totalizing, anti-Christian state apparatus that arises in the future. The application for us as teachers and leaders is incredibly liberating. We do not have to fall down the rabbit hole of obsessive historical reconstruction. Instead, we are called to teach our congregations to recognize the spirit of the beast in any human institution, government, or economic system that demands the ultimate allegiance and worship that belongs exclusively to Jesus Christ. Final synthesis, proclaiming the eschatological consummation. Certainly the death and resurrection of Christ are fundamental to John's message and the key to history, but Revelation also celebrates the eschatological consummation that is coming. As we bring this foundational seminar to its conclusion, we must firmly establish the ultimate theological destination of the Book of Revelation. In some modern academic circles, there is a strong movement to completely strip the future, eschatological hope out of the text. Scholars like Maloney argue that Revelation is not pointing to a future return of Christ, but is merely using highly stylized poetry to describe the victory that was already fully accomplished in the past through the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. While it is absolutely true that the slaughtered lamb on the cross is the undisputed center of John's theology and the key that unlocks all of human history, Schreiner vigorously defends the necessity of the future horizon. If we remove the actual, literal return of Christ, the final judgment of evil, and the physical recreation of the cosmos into a new heaven and a new earth, we completely get the apocalyptic hope of the suffering church. The cross is indeed the definitive mechanism of our victory, but the glorious New Jerusalem is its ultimate, required realization. The book both comforts and challenges believers with its symbols and imagery. This profound, succinct statement by Schreiner captures the absolute essence of how we must apply the Book of Revelation in our ministries today. Revelation has a dual pastoral mandate. First, it is designed to intensely comfort the afflicted. For the believer who has lost their job, their freedom, or their family because of their allegiance to Jesus, Revelation pulls back the curtain to reveal that their suffering is not meaningless. It promises that the sovereign God will personally judge their oppressors and physically wipe away every single tear from their eyes. But simultaneously, Revelation is designed to violently challenge the comfortable. For the believer who is sitting in the affluent church of Laodicea, or the modern Western church, happily compromising with the idolatries, the sexual ethics, and the economic enticements of Babylon, Revelation sounds a terrifying alarm. It warns them to come out of her, lest they share in her plagues. Therefore, our application in the modern pulpit must hold these twin realities in perfect, razor-sharp tension. We do not preach the Book of Revelation to satisfy intellectual curiosity regarding end-times timelines. We preach it to produce radical, uncompromising discipleship in the present moment, anchored by the unshakable, magnificent certainty that the kingdom of this world will soon become the kingdom of our Lord and of His Christ.